Man's growth, unfoldment, and evolution are the conditions of liberty and freedom. Here to discuss these important topics are Mr. Ralph M.Lewis, Imperator of the Rosicrucian Order, and your host, Miss Christy Knudsen, Public Relations Officer for the Rosicrucians, in a program presented at the 1986 World Convention in New York City. And now, your host, Miss Knudsen.
Hello, fratres and sorors. I am Christy Knudsen, AMORC's Public Relations Director, and on this occasion of our 1986 Rosicrucian World Convention, it is my pleasure to introduce to you now our beloved Imperator, Frater Ralph M. Lewis.
Welcome, fratres and sorors, to this auspicious occasion, the World Convention of the Rosicrucian Order.
Frater Lewis, the theme of our convention this year is liberty, and I think that this is something that has, it's a very important idea for our members. As a mystic, Frater Lewis, what do you feel the idea of liberty means?
Well, in the first place, psychologically, liberty has two aspects, two different meanings. One is the sense of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of action. And the other is repression, that we can be repressed and not enjoy freedom. And repression is one that we experience quite commonly today. But first let me say that there is no such thing as absolute freedom. We find people objecting to anyone telling them what they should do or what they cannot do. I am a free soul. You hear that phrase very common. We're not free souls. We have certain limitations. We wouldn't have society today if each person was going off in a separate direction, trying to satisfy their desires. We have to contribute something to society. We have to contribute a certain amount of our liberty towards certain objectives or ends. And unfortunately, that's not being done. And for an individual to say that he should experience absolute freedom, we are not absolute freedom as a biological being. We have to eat, we have to sleep, we have to drink, we have to do many things that are necessary to live. And we are not free from those conditions, and we must recognize that we are bound to contribute a certain amount of our personal freedom for the existence of society.
Frater Lewis, you mentioned the idea of restraint. Have you yourself personally in your life experienced a restraint of your freedom?
Yes, quite often in the New York subway at 5 o'clock. But in addition to that, yes, I have. When I have tried to approach people with an idea, expecting an open mind and reception, they resented it, primarily because what I was going to say was different than their idea. Now, what I had to say may not have been accurate, but they should have been reasonably welcome my idea to compare with theirs, at least to see whether there is any objection and to have a mutual understanding. It is this closed business that we have today which limits society and does away with individualism. It brings little groups, one group contrary and opposed to another.
Over the centuries, Frater Lewis, this idea of freedom of thought, over the centuries, how has the order contributed to liberty, to freedom of thought?
Well, in the first place, in trying to make people realize there is much knowledge to be learned. There is much that they should know and don't know. Unfortunately, today in our society, we have people who are of this century in their habiliments only. They wear the clothes, they have cars, they have television, they go to the motion pictures, but their minds are closed in the thoughts and the rigidity of the Middle Ages. And unfortunately, Orthodox religion sometimes is supportive to such ideas. They say that you must not go beyond what we teach you, because this is sacred, and anything beyond that is wrong. It is this kind of reasoning. If what I believe, I think is right, then the reasoning follows this way. Anything then that is opposed to what I think obviously isn't right, and therefore it's not right, it's wrong. And if it's what's wrong, I must attack it. And that's what you see today, so much so.
What can our individual members then, obviously we have many members who live in countries that have repressive governments, who are not allowed to exhibit a freedom of thought politically. What is it that our members can do to further the cause of liberty without perhaps bucking up against political problems?
Well, it's extremely difficult for them. There is definitely a repression, not only in thought, but in physically, too, if they get it. The point is to build themselves up with the free knowledge as much as they possibly can, but not try to broadcast it under those circumstances, because they would only be criticized. But in a free society like this, we find that, like we say, a free society in the United States, we have a certain liberalism here that exists. We find that some of our members do not have the courage to say that I am a Rosicrucian, because somebody else will say, you belong to that? Instead of saying, yes, I belong to that, I'm proud of that. And you should retry then, your opinion is different. Have you been a member? They'll probably say, no, I've never been a member. I wouldn't read anything about it. Then you're speaking from ignorance, isn't that right? In other words, if you haven't got the courage to stand behind your organization, and you don't feel it quite convinced that you're doing the right thing, don't be in the organization. But if you're in the organization, show the sufficiently militant attitude to defend what you feel is right by speaking freely. I don't mean you must try to disrupt other people's thoughts, but to express your views, and if they don't accept them, well. But when they attack the organization and make false statements, don't draw within yourself. Have the courage to express what you feel is right. If you don't think you're right, if you're not confident in the organization, you'll never get anywhere.
You've used a word that I think is really important. You used the word ignorance. And it seems to me that the purpose of the Rosicrucian Order is to combat ignorance, superstition, and fear. With this in mind, Frater Lewis, what are the views of the Order on the devil, Satan, evil spirits? Can we really, and I know that this is important for a lot of members, can we really be controlled by outside evil forces?
Well, the belief in an evil force, in an entity that is evil, is basically very primitive and is height of superstition. It goes back to the period of Zoroastrianism, when Mazda was a god of light, Ahriman was a god of darkness, and they were conflicting with each other for the capture of the human soul. And there is the beginning of an entity of a devil and so on. Well, I think we go back to one of the books that Dr. Lewis wrote, Mental Poisoning. If you fear such a thing by believing in it, you are going to be affected by it. But the effect is not an external thing. It's not an entity. It's your own thoughts that are inhibiting you, causing you to go back in within yourself. And whenever something happens, you believe it's an evil entity. Now, primitive man, if he walked along a road and a rock fell near him, he believed that everything was determined to be as it is. And therefore that rock was an entity and was going to destroy him and hurt him. Now, what is evil and what is good? Are they really definite things? Psychologically, what we call good is anything that satisfies our desires, whether they are physical, intellectual, aesthetic, or whatever they may be. If they satisfy us, that's good. If they're adverse, irritable to us, that's evil. And so consequently, those are things that affect us, but it doesn't mean that they are determined by an entity anymore. When that rock fell down, if it hit you on the head, it wasn't determined to hit you or destroy you. And there is no thing as absolute evil. The only thing that we can say that we could do would really be evil is to act contrary to natural laws that we know are helpful to us. If a natural law is helpful to us, let us abide by it. But when we abuse it in some way, and it affects us, that is the evil. But we are the creator of the evil, not the thing itself.
You know, as a kind of in the same framework, but another kind of restraint that we experience are the limitations of illness, old age, physical disabilities. People with this kind of restraint, is it possible for us with these limitations to experience cosmic consciousness, to experience spiritual freedom, if you will?
Well, what you're trying to say is, if we are physically deteriorating, does that help us affect our spiritual self? If the spiritual self is something that man can corrupt, or it can corrupt him, or he can corrupt him, then it's not truly spiritual. We hear people talking about saving the soul, and the soul being corrupted, and or the salvation and improvement and evolving of the soul. At the same time, they'll say, what is the origin of the soul? Well, the soul is divine.